Let's take a look at some of the exercises that I gave you for this week. The emphasis this week is on beginning argument analysis. And the key to that always, no matter if it's a short argument, a long argument, a complex argument, a bad argument, a good argument, is identifying conclusions and identifying premises. And that is not an easy thing to do. I really think that it's a very difficult thing to do. It's difficult when we come across real world arguments, as we will when we begin to look at the real world editorials, philosophical arguments that we'll be looking at later in the semester. But even in the simplest sort of specimen argument, it's not really an obvious thing. For instance, if we look at number 1 here, Jim is the worst student in class. He never does his homework. His essays are sloppy, and he usually falls asleep during lectures. Well, if we just look at that without trying to read any sense into it or trying to read some reasoning into it, if we just sort of let it sort of wash across our consciousness, you just have 4 claims, right? He's the worst student in class. He never does his homework. His essays are sloppy. He usually falls asleep during lectures. There's no inference indicators. There's no language there that helps you identify the first claim as the conclusion to an argument, with the other 3 claims being supporting reasons, premises. So it's rather mysterious how we do it. I'm sure many of you did it correctly. It's really not, there's no method here, really, because, again, there's no inference indicators that give away the logical relationship between the different statements. We simply have to recognize that the second, third, and fourth statements contained in the second sentence all give reasons to think that Jim is the worst student in class. Obviously, when we get to number 2 here, I've kind of prompted you, right? As if we identify this as a kind of as a typical kind of claim that needs to be supported. Jim's the worst student in class. Certainly saying Philadelphia is the worst city in America seems like something, if you're going to say it, you have to prove it. You have to give, or at least you have to prove it, but you have to give reasons for it, because it's a rather radical claim. So we get a feeling for the kind of things that we think should be supported. And certainly Philadelphia is the worst city in America is the conclusion to the argument of number 2. And it has high taxes, and taxes have a big impact on quality of life, are supporting reasons for really, really dreadful argument, but still an argument, right? So it's not really clear how we do it, I mean, we hear literacy or fluency, I should say, in a certain language is incredibly helpful to really listening for. If you are really geared towards looking for reasoning, you kind of hear it almost in a kind of rhetorical way rather than some purely logical way. Now, number 3 gets us into arguments which maybe are a little bit more complex, right? A little bit harder. It's not obvious, like from a first reading, what even if there is any argumentation here. After the extinction of the dinosaurs about 65 million years ago, the largest mammal was a tree shrew about the size of a large rat. If we go much further back in Earth history, the only living things were primitive sea creatures. Even farther back reveals a world of simple one-celled organisms. Human beings should realize that they have humble evolutionary beginnings. Well, maybe it just seems obvious. Maybe it just is obvious that the last sentence is the conclusion to the argument that human beings should realize they have humble evolutionary beginnings. I don't know how you recognize that, really. I mean, you have to sort of do it. Certainly, it's only when we read that last sentence that we get a sense of what the logic really was of pointing out these different things about evolution. We don't. I mean, these are just sort of bare statements, all in the same area about about earlier forms of life, but we don't really get a sense of how they fit together or why they're being stated until that last statement about us having to realize that we have humble evolutionary beginnings, which we certainly do, right? But in a certain way, that sort of ties everything together. Oh, yeah, that's why you're pointing out that these things about evolution that we to give it to. You're making a case that we should realize that we come from very humble evolutionary beginnings. One-celled animals, primitive sea creatures are our ancestors. So what we make of that. Number 4, you should never turn your back on a Klingon. I mean, that maybe is more obvious, right? Well, first of all, what's a Klingon? But don't worry about that; it doesn't matter. But you should never turn your back on one. I mean, it just raises that kind of claim just raises questions. Well, why? Why shouldn't I? Well, because they're the most aggressive and treacherous. They try to kill all the Starfleet captains. They're untrustworthy. Whatever, these ridiculous things about the Star Trek world, which aren't even true in the Star Trek world, right? But that the giveaway there, or the hint there, is the way that certain claims just sort of cry out for support, so that if anybody is making the claims in a sensible, rational way, they're just naturally going to try to back them up by pointing things out that serve as evidence for the truth of the claim. Should never turn your back on a Klingon. Well, why not? Number 5, no one in their right mind would become a philosophy major. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics report that philosophy majors earn substantially less upon graduation than their peers who have majored in areas like engineering and business. In addition, philosophy majors are generally scorned by hiring managers for major corporations. None of this is true, by the way. It's just all made up. Philosophy may enable you to deal better with the big issues of reality and truth, but it is useless for dealing with real-world practical problems. Okay. Again, you have a list in a way. If you don't read it with a certain amount of nuance, or looking for hints, or looking for statements that seem to cry out for substantiation, it's just a list of claims, all of which may or may not be true, but all of which could certainly do with some supporting evidence or some supporting reasons in support of them. But we're sort of looking for the statement that kind of ties things together and serves as maybe the major point of the text. And it seems to me to be this. But all of the things that come after really give us reason to believe that no one who is thinking rightly, no one in their right mind, would become a philosophy major because of all of these reasons. It's a bad argument. By the way, it's not that I'm not, I made it up, and I don't think it's a good argument at all. And this premise here is actually false. And I think this one is false as well. But here we're not evaluating arguments. We are just trying to identify them. And I think this is clearly the overall point, major conclusion, the thing that is actually supported or purportedly supported by the premises that follow. Philosophy is a good major to pick, just to show that we can play this game any way we want. Philosophers such as Plato, Thomas Aquinas, and Immanuel Kant are amongst the most important and influential figures in Western civilization. Philosophy majors are also required to study logic and critical reasoning, which is likely to improve their skills in reasoning, problem solving, and the evaluation of arguments. Philosophy majors also tend to be thoughtful and morally trustworthy. Thoughtful and morally trustworthy. I think philosophy majors are thoughtful. Morally trustworthy, that's really a stretch, which are assets in finding jobs. Okay, so just to show that, here we should just pick up on, right? I think read in context and sequence in here. I mean, clearly, this is what we're trying to support with entirely different sorts of claims. So that's, I don't need to go through everything here. I just wanted to give you a sense of like how I read it, I made up all these arguments, but, the kind of things that, it is difficult because, again, there's no method here, especially when there are no inference indicators. You simply have to make guesses and about what the structure of the argument actually is.